In 1839, it was said that most of the half-breeds live at Green Bay and the Portage. While it would never grow to become the size of the older Green Bay Métis settlement, the distinctly Métis community at Portage was at its peak during the decades from the 1820s to 1840. It was perhaps the only Métis settlement in existence at the time, in which the majority held Ho-Chunk kinship ties. In this era of cultural shifts and movements, we are offered a special window into the individual stories and collective trends which affected Métis life, particularly Ho-Chunk Métis life. During this time, upward of 100 Métis and French-Canadian people, and very few others, would come to call this place home, alongside their Ho-Chunk relatives. With 36 family units represented, the Portage French and Métis community rivaled the population of Fort Winnebago's garrison. What brought these largely forgotten people here in the first place? Why Portage? Two catalysts which have spurred movements of people groups all through history were at work here also: kinship and occupation. The seasonal rhythms of British and French fur trading had been felt here since the 1670s, but it wasn't until a few decades before the 1830s that a year-round Métis presence at Portage emerged. Augustin Grignon, the father of one of Portage's Métis youth, recalled that the first year-round French resident of Portage was French-Canadian Laurent Barth, a trader from Michilimackinac, who acquired permission from Ho-Chunk leaders to work there in the early 1790s. Ho-Chunk families from Lake Puckaway converged to live nearby shortly after, with Chugiga, or Spoon Decora, a prominent leader of the nation, establishing a substantial village on the Wisconsin River at Portage by the turn of the century. Chugiga, although being culturally Ho-Chunk, was himself Métis. His mother, Humbongoinga, was a Ho-Chunk chief in her own right, and had married a French military officer and trader named Sabrevoire de Carey, passing down leadership to children and grandchildren, who would become major figures in 19th century Ho-Chunk history. Among Chugiga's large family, 5 sons and 3 daughters married within the Ho-Chunk nation. But 2 of his daughters married French people, creating kinship ties to this location. Their families would become the early nucleus of Métis Portage. Shortly after Barth's arrival, Chugiga's daughter, Monantisi, married French trader Jean Le Cuyer. Around 1798, Le Cuyer settled permanently with Monantisi at Portage. As was the case throughout most of Métis Portage's history, it was occupation which brought both Le Cuyer and Barth to this particular spot. The geological feature which formed the carrying place between the Fox and Wisconsin rivers resulted in numerous boatloads of furs and other goods being hauled across this swampy lowland each year. Carrying thousands of pounds of cargo across a snake-infested marsh path was burdensome, and Le Cuyer sought to make his living by creating an easier way to navigate the Portage Trail. Grignon recalled, "Barth had only a single-horse cart, but when Le Cuyer came, he had several teams and carts, and had a heavy wagon with a lawn reach, constructed by a wagon maker he had brought there, so as to transport barges from river to river." Le Cuyer also continued trading, and this combination of trade and overland portaging formed the basis for Métis Portage's occupations over the next 30 years, as other families joined in meeting the demand. These trade and transport endeavors spurred a need for blacksmiths, laborers, clerks, and agricultural workers at an area farming enterprise. These roles were almost exclusively filled by French Canadians, Ho-Chunks, and Métis. While permanent families at Portage were limited to 1 or 2 at a time into the early 1820s, Over the next decade, offspring of early Portage Métis were coming of age and taking part in society alongside additional families which were arriving and being formed. If it was work which brought Le Cuyer here, it was likely his Ho-Chunk kinship which kept him here. Perhaps it was also kinship which opened the door to his permission by Ho-Chunks to work here in the first place. Following Le Cuyer's early death, Mathis became an employer, engaging Sabrevoir de Carré's French nephew to manage the portaging business for her until her daughter, Therese, married French trader François Leroy, a Menominee Métis who carried on the business. Looking beyond Métis families living permanently at Portage, occupation also brought other Métis people into close and regular involvement at Portage without living here. Some followed their family ties deep into Ho-Chunk country surrounding Portage, working among their indigenous in-laws. To a number of trading outfits, the Great Lakes were the direct source of merchandise and supplies. But to some of these 1830s residents of the interior, such as Canadian trader Oliver Amel, Portage became their supply depot. Amel had married a Ho-Chunk woman whose birth name was Hinuga, also known as Kagiwiga or Raven Woman. While they lived at the Four Lakes of present-day Madison, Portage was his annual source of trade goods. Another, Abraham Wood, who operated a grog shop at Portage in the early 1830s, married a daughter of Ho-Chunk elder Quickhart of the Rock River Band, and moved to his in-laws' region to trade. Other regular occupational visitors to the Portage were the colorful voyageur boatmen who kept the fur trade moving along the Fox-Wisconsin corridor. Green Bay or Prairie du Chien-based voyageurs, such as Vitelle and Guadapi, who is believed to be part of a mixed Menominee family, added seasonal spice to the community. Surveying the Métis landscape of Portage through the lens of occupation reveals yet another group of people who lived here permanently, but were not heads of their own households. Let's pause and zoom in here. The historical record attests to servants and slaves within Green Bay's Métis community, and indicates their presence at Portage and Prairie du Chien. Non-Métis newcomers such as Indian agent John Kinzie also brought very young family servants from Chicago to the Portage in the early 1830s. Through Juliette Kinzie's writings, we get scattered glimpses into the lives of two of these youths in servitude, Thomas and Josette. Juliette speaks of bringing 10-year-old Josette Wilmette, daughter of a French father and Potawatomi mother, to Portage as a bound girl, meaning an indentured servant bound to serve a set period of years. Earlier in life, Josette had been to the St. Joseph Mission School. In the Kinzie household, she continued her studies in the background of cooking, managing laundry, and serving guests alongside Mary Pillon, the French wife of one of the agency employees. We hear more about Josette's young counterpart, Thomas Mirandou, who was the youngest brother of earlier Kinzie household servants in Chicago. Mirandou descendants remembered how Thomas' French father, Jean-Baptiste, and Odawa mother, Wish-to-Yuqua, had spent their early days moving seasonally between the Milwaukee River and Lake Kashkanan. Jean-Baptiste Mirandou was a father Thomas likely never knew. In the wake of Jean's early death around 1819, Wish-to-Yuqua reintegrated into her Potawatomi relatives' community, raising her family within Potawatomi culture near Fox Lake, Illinois. When Thomas was around 14 years old, his path crossed with Indian agent John Kinzie on an early 1833 surveying trip to the area, at which time Kinzie purchased land granted by treaty to his older sister Jane. Juliette Kinzie relates one perspective of this young boy's life at Portage.
While surveying, the attention of my husband was drawn toward a very bright-looking boy in Indian costume, who went hopping along by the side of the assistant that carried the chain. He inquired who the lad was, and, to his surprise, learned that he was the brother of the old family servants Victoire, Genevieve, and Baptiste. Toma was in blanket and leggings, and had always lived in a wigwam. My husband inquired if he would like to go to Fort Winnebago with him, and learn to be a white boy. The idea pleased him much, and his mother having given her sanction to the arrangement, they set forth on their return journey. Toma had been equipped in jacket and trousers with the other articles of apparel necessary to his new sphere and character. They were near the Eau Plaine and approaching the residence of Claude Leframbois, where Toma knew he should meet acquaintances. He asked leave to get out of the wagon and walk a little way. When the gentleman next saw him, he was in full Potawatomi costume. Although it was bitter winter weather, he had put on his uncomfortable native garb, rather than show himself to his old friends in a state of transformation. On his arrival at Fort Winnebago, our first care was to furnish him with a complete wardrobe, which, having been placed in a box in his sleeping apartment, was put under his charge. Words cannot express his delight as the valuable possessions were confided to him. Every spare moment was devoted to their contemplation. Now and then, Toma would be missing. He was invariably found seated by the side of his little trunk, folding and refolding his clothes, laying them now lengthwise, now crosswise. Our next step was to teach him to be useful. Such little offices were assigned to him at first as might be supposed not altogether new to him. His next office was to lay the table. We were to have a tea party one evening, all the families and young officers from the fort. To make Toma's appearance as professional as possible, we made him a white apron with long sleeves to put on while he was helping Mary and Josette to carry round tea. He acquitted himself to perfection, for he had never any difficulty in imitating what he saw another do.
We've surveyed some of the pulls which brought this varied community together, and we've met a few individuals along the way as we've surveyed Portage's vocational scene. Toma's young life in particular cracks open the door to additional questions. What was Portage's Métis community in a cultural sense? What social and life rhythm choices did they make? What cultural forces, opportunities, and expectations did they face and contend with? Being somewhere in between established cultures meant traversing uncharted territory. Who were these folks as people? Join us as we dig deeper in episode 3.